This week, we'll be exploring mysteries that range from the finest, most well-crafted fabric in all of human history that was made for thousands of years for kings, queens, royalty, rulers. It was finer, lighter, rarer, and more expensive than silk. How exactly it was made remains a mystery to this day. We'll also explore mysteries that range from one of the most brutal triple murders I have ever covered to this mysterious, unidentified woman that had on her multiple disguises, multiple identities, and was found alone, dead, in the mountains of Norway in some very suspicious circumstances. We will explore all of those and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is pretty plain English tea, bit of milk, bit of honey, and join me as we explore the unsolved mysteries iceberg. Dhaka muslin is or was this fascinating material. It was super light and soft, and for thousands of years this material was sought after by kings, queens, rich people, well-to-do people, people in power, because it was just an insane fabric that could be produced nowhere else in the world. It was made in like modern-day Bangladesh, and it was coveted by the ancient Greeks, by the Chinese, Europeans, Africans, Arabs, just, as I said, all over the world. And dresses or clothes made from this material could often take up to a year to produce, and they sold for, in today's money, thousands of dollars or pounds. Like, it was roughly 26, 27 times as expensive as silk was. And as you know, silk in and of itself is quite expensive. It was made in a single city, and the art of making it was such a specialized craft that different sections of Dhaka had like different communities that were each specialized in certain steps of the process. So that's how hard and specialized this skill was. You couldn't even in one lifetime be skilled enough at the entire process in order to produce one yourself. You had to work for years and years and years at one specific particular task that made up this entire process, and then as a community, as a city, you would produce one of these items. And as I said, we are no longer able to produce it. So the fabric itself was made from cotton, but not just any cotton. This was a particular strain of cotton that only grew in specific areas along the Meghna River. And this rare, special strain people naturally have tried to take and grow somewhere else so they can, spread out the production of this Dhaka muslin. But this strain basically couldn't live anywhere else. And when they tried to take it and move it and grow it somewhere else, it just died. So they could only grow it in this area, which is a little strange, but it also made the cloth itself more specialized, more rare, because it couldn't become a worldwide crop. Now, this particular strain of cotton was in and of itself quite brittle, quite soft, and so normally when you're making cotton, something like this type of crop would actually be a bad thing. Like if the cotton is too brittle, if it's too easily destroyed, then when you're crafting the normal cotton clothes, the brittleness would just mean it breaks or snaps easily, so it's a little hard to make clothes out of. But this particular characteristic of this strain actually made it very useful for making strands of cotton that were extremely thin and extremely soft. The only issue was they needed to be handled with extreme care. And it was this craft, this delicacy, that took years to train into people. They often used smaller women for this craft, as they had smaller, softer hands. They were able to, craft the fabric more delicately. And to put into perspective just how soft and delicate this was, we need to talk about something called thread count. And that is, if you take a single square inch of cloth, so like, I don't know what it would be, like that or something, within this square of cloth, you have to count how many threads are in that square. So say my fingers were threads. Yeah, don't ask. But say this was a square of cloth. You have 4 threads going horizontally and 4 threads going vertically. So in this square of cloth, this would have a 8 thread count. You just add up the ones going sideways with the ones going upwards, and that's basically how you come to that number. So an 8 thread count is a very low number, and nobody would want to buy a blanket made out of my fingers. That might just be the weirdest thing I've ever said. But the normal thread count for cotton in today's age is anywhere between like 40 and 80 sort of range. And the higher up thread count you go, typically the smaller and more fine the threads need to be in order to fit in this 1 square inch. So the material normally gets softer, it gets lighter typically, and it often gets quite thin because the threads need to be quite thin and light in order to fit that many in. So between 40 and 80 for typical cotton cloth. Silk sits at around 300 on the low end, and for the finest silks they're normally at around like 600-700 thread count. But this Dhaka muslin sat around an estimated 1200 to 1300 thread count. So basically double the thread count of the finest silks that we have. And this is made from cotton. So you compare the 40 to 80 typical cotton range today to 12 or 1300, and you can see just how rare and sought after this material was. And there's actually been attempts to try and, recreate this material. They've gone to like master weavers, these small villages, small towns sort of thing, that do this as a living. And they said, look, we're trying to make a 300 count cotton cloth to at least get the ball rolling to start off with. And most people they spoke to said, you're completely crazy. There's no way I'm making a 300 count cotton cloth. That's just completely absurd. But they did get 1 or 2 people that were willing to try, and they did actually successfully, after months, make a 300 count cotton cloth, which was one of the finest cotton cloths that has been made in recent times. So it is possible, but this entire craft, this entire Dhaka muslin industry, it all basically disappeared when the British invaded India. So Dhaka was always kind of world famous for this material, and when the English invaded, they started to learn more and more about this craft. So they would have people go to the factories, sit in the village, ask the people questions. They would take notes on the whole process, see exactly how it's made, exactly what the weavers do, and their plan was basically to learn from the local people and to take the craft for themselves. And after a few years of observing the people, they basically tried to do just that. They started to make cotton tops, cotton cloth, and this was with an inferior cotton strain, so it was never as fine, never as light, never as soft as the Dhaka muslin. But the British didn't really care as long as they could keep selling them off, keep making a profit. And in order to stifle their competition, they basically shut down production of Dhaka muslin. They started to put taxes on it. They started to shut down these factories, or maybe factory is the wrong word, but the areas that these people made these cloths in. And they basically just made it kind of financially impossible to be a weaver, unless you wanted to basically starve to death or to be a slave to the British. It was impossible to hold down that job and to feed your family or even yourself. A lot of the families that had been weavers in this craft, in this industry for like generations, they ended up having to sell up. They moved to the cities where the jobs were, and we basically just lost this craft within 1 generation. And because we lost the craft, nobody was really able to use this particular strain of cotton, and because no one was using it and it wasn't being harvested, it too started to just die off and then disappear back into the wilderness, and we eventually also lost the strain of cotton. So now if you go back to Dhaka, where Dhaka was, where they were producing this fabric, the strain that they used to use is no longer there. It's essentially completely died out, and there have been some efforts made to try and rediscover this strain. They've gone into the wilderness, they've done like DNA tests on some of the cotton in there, and they have found some strains that are like 80% match, 90% match, but they are still not exactly the cotton that they used back then. So they have taken this like 90% similar strain, they have tried to make the best cotton they can out of it, but even that is only like a 300 thread count, nowhere near the 1300 that used to be made. So they would basically have to rediscover this entire craft. They would have to train people for years and years and years, maybe even a generation or 2, and they would either have to genetically modify or actually find the exact strain that they used back then, and they would have to do all of that in order to remake this Dhaka muslin that was so massively sought after all over the world for thousands of years. It is a possibility. I don't know how likely it is. I do hope they reproduce it somehow, but for now, the production of this incredible divine-like fabric is a mystery. The Dundas Island Blackflies. So Blackflies are these monstrous little creatures. They swarm you, they bite you, they actually suck your blood and bite little pieces of flesh off you. So yeah, really, really horrible creatures. But Dundas Island specifically is said to contain these legendary blackflies that are like 5 to 6 inches in length. So imagine a fly this big, flying, bumping into you, swarming you, and sucking your blood and eating your flesh. Like, yeah, thing of nightmares. There aren't any available photographs of this creature, as they are sort of a legendary cryptid sort of creature, and maybe anyone who's tried to take a photo of them with a camera has had their bloody camera eaten. So what the hell, how are we supposed to get footage of them? But as I said, they are truly a thing of nightmares, and one that I hope doesn't exist, but you never do know. Ettore Majorana, which that's a pretty good Italian impression. I guess you need to use your hands as well. Ettore Majorana. But he was this mathematician, this super genius essentially, who mysteriously went missing in 1938 in Italy. He was a bit of a whiz kid growing up, a bit of a savant, a super genius sort of thing, and he originally started off in engineering, but then eventually went on to theoretical physics. And, you know, he was fantastic at maths, which made physics obviously a lot easier. He made some breakthroughs in physics, in science, and there was actually a quote made by world famous physicist Enrico Fermi, who we covered some of his stuff earlier up in the Iceberg, you know, stuff like Fermi's paradox. But Fermi himself was insanely intelligent, he was very well accomplished, and he had this to say about Majorana. He said that there are several categories of scientists in the world. Those of second or third rank do their best but never get very far. Then there is the first rank, those who make important discoveries fundamental to scientific progress. But then there are the geniuses, like Galileo, like Newton, and Majorana was one of these. He worked on some fun things like neutrinos, like neutrons, and was arguably somewhat responsible for the breakthrough that actually led to the development of nuclear stuff, so nuclear energy, and of course nuclear weapons. And he himself used to think that what he did was like quite boring. Like, yeah, he was good at it and he liked it, but he didn't really see why anyone else would like it. He only published 9 papers in his entire life, which for some students, for some scientists, that's a very, very low number. But he just didn't really care. He just liked what he was doing. He didn't really need to publish papers to, get attention, to spread his ideas. He didn't really care about that. And everyone around him was like, this guy's so crazy. Like, he's so clever. He's making all these breakthroughs. While he himself was like, it's kind of whatever. As I said, he worked with Fermi, he worked with Bohr, he worked with Heisenberg, but he worked with all of these top world famous scientists, and apparently held his own even though he was relatively young, until in 1933 he came down with this horrible case of gastritis, which is like this horrible inflammation of the stomach lining. Very uncomfortable, somewhat painful. So when this happened, Majorana basically became a recluse. He stopped replying to friends, he stopped going out or socializing as much. He spent a lot less time at work and in the university, a lot more time in his own home. And during this time, he basically talked to no one, basically published no papers. And it was about 4 years after this that he actually became a full professor at the University of Naples for theoretical physics. But it was this same year that he became a full professor that he withdrew all of his money from his bank and made the journey from Naples to Palermo, and then bought a return ticket back to Naples, and he was never seen again. And nobody's really sure what happened to him, whether he disappeared while in Palermo, whether he actually got on the boat and disappeared while he was on the boat, or whether he got back to Naples and then disappeared from there, or whether he just didn't go to Naples at all and maybe went from Palermo to somewhere else in the world. We're not sure if he did something to himself, or if he was captured or killed or abducted or anything like that. Like, the evidence is a little light for really any of these theories, but what we do have is a letter that Majorana wrote to the director of the Naples Physics Institute, and that letter read as follows: De Carelli, and I can't keep this Italian accent up forever, if it is even an Italian accent, but the letter said, I made a decision that has become unavoidable. There isn't a bit of selfishness in it, but I realize what trouble my sudden disappearance will cause you and your students. For this as well, I beg your forgiveness, but especially for betraying your trust, the sincere friendship and the sympathy you gave me over the past months. I ask you to remember me to all those I learned to know and appreciate in your institute, especially Shuti. I will keep a fond memory of them all, at least until 11 p.m. tonight, possibly later too. E. Majorana. So, honestly, a very strange case. The West lost one of the greatest minds, maybe of that generation, maybe of that century, and in such a strange way too. Nobody has confirmed where he went, what happened to him. We never found a body or anything like that. And some of the theories say he, did something to himself, or that he just ran away because he didn't like the spotlight. Maybe he wanted to go like super recluse, change his name, go to some strange part of the world, just live a normal life sort of thing. Or since this was around the time that nuclear weapons were being developed, there was always a theory that he had been captured by the Germans, forced to work in an underground facility or something, or that he was captured by the Americans for the same reason. Now, the fact that he wrote a letter and seemed to know what was coming leans it, I think, slightly more towards him either running away or doing something to himself. But there's always the possibility that he knew he was going away to America to help work on an atomic bomb or something, and the Americans had spoken to him beforehand, and so he knew he was going, but maybe it wasn't his choice. That's always a possibility as well. And there was actually a guy spotted in South America that was said to look very, very similar to Majorana, and this was 20 years after he disappeared. So if that were true, then that means he, likely fled the country, ran away to South America, Venezuela, Argentina, and he lived the rest of his life in peace, in solitude, in anonymity. And given his history, that's not too unlikely either. But all of these are, of course, theories, and the truth about what actually happened to Majorana is still, to this day, an unsolved mystery. The Exmoor Body was the unidentified body of a man found in Somerset, England in 2002. And this incident or case essentially was started when these people found along the side of the road this body, essentially, except they didn't really know it was a body when they found it. It was this, thing, this nebulous thing, and it was wrapped up in plastic bags and bedding, so they weren't really sure what it was, but they called the police, they did a further investigation of it, and it was in fact the body of a man that they estimated had likely been dead for around 2 years. They couldn't identify the body, there was no ID or identifying clothing or anything, but they did find that he had a golden pendant with a Quran verse on, so they assumed this man must have been a Muslim, maybe Arab, maybe Northern African sort of thing, and he had also seemingly suffered a violent injury, a violent attack, before his death, and then he was killed, and then he was likely hidden somewhere, as the police said this body wasn't at this site for 2 years. Like, it had just only recently been dumped, but he had been dead for 2 years. So where the body was hidden before that, police kind of had no idea. And who he was, where he was killed, why he was killed, and who killed him is still, to this day, a complete mystery. Fermi Balls. Now, please forgive me because we're going to get into some super complex, but also super interesting and fascinating topics. And once again, as always, I will try and simplify it as much as possible. But Fermi Balls are named after the world-famous physicist who we mentioned a few entries up, but these are essentially an explanation, or a possible explanation, for what dark matter is. And dark matter, as we've explored higher up on this iceberg, is in and of itself an insane mystery. And I'll try and summarize and explain dark matter real quick here. But basically, scientists look out into space, they look at other galaxies, and they add up the rough amount of mass in these galaxies, and then they're able to determine the rough amount of gravity that that mass is producing. And with this amount of gravity, these galaxies and these systems would simply fling themselves apart. Like, there's not enough gravity within the system to actually hold it together. Like, the amount of mass that we can see is only producing roughly like 15% of the gravity that we would need in order to hold these galaxies together. So scientists figured that that other 85% of gravity has got to come from somewhere, and it's clearly not coming from any of the matter or mass that we can see. So this matter or mass that we can't see, that is producing most of the gravity, scientists call dark matter. It's like if we looked out towards the sun, and instead of this giant ball of, sun, this giant ball of gas. Instead of that, if we just observed this tiny ping pong ball sun or something, like tiny, we would say, okay, we're spinning around the sun, clearly, so there is some gravity coming from the sun. It's able to hold the planets together, it's able to hold the system together, but the mass that we can see, the sun, it's not producing nearly the amount of gravity that we are experiencing. So in that example, we might suggest something like dark matter, some matter around the sun or within the solar system that we just can't currently observe. And that is basically dark matter in a nutshell. And hopefully these analogies, these explanations are making sense, as I know I'm not always the best at explaining things. But yeah, that was basically dark matter. But when scientists came up with this theory, that obviously produced more questions about, okay, dark matter exists, but what exactly is dark matter? And that's where theories like the Fermi Balls come in. These are theories that work at figuring out or explaining or hypothesizing on what dark matter might be. And Fermi Balls suggests that at the beginning of the universe, when everything was more densely packed together, it was hotter, these tiny black holes formed all over the, tiny universe, and they were able to form in the trillions. And now these tiny black holes are still permeated throughout the entire universe. Just as I said, trillions and trillions and trillions of them. They are tiny, they might even be subatomic, and they don't interact with light because they are, black holes, so we wouldn't be able to see them, but they would have some insane density, some insane mass, and would, in theory, be responsible for producing all of this gravity. And it does sound like science fiction when I explain it and simplify it all out like this, but I promise there is at least some decent science behind it, and at least for me, it is a very, very interesting one. And I think the real mystery here isn't necessarily Fermi Balls, but rather what Fermi Balls is trying to explain, dark matter. But moving on, our next entry is Fermi Bubbles, which, wow, another Fermi entry. What are the odds? It's not like these are listed alphabetically or anything, but anyway, Fermi Bubbles are another phenomenon, or they're more a phenomenon, I guess, than Fermi Balls. But Fermi Bubbles refer to these groovy looking shapes, these things shooting or, growing or emerging seemingly out of our galaxy. And they are just super, super cool. Like, I just love space stuff so much. And basically, the mystery here is we have no idea what is causing these, halos, these glows out of our galaxy. They are gamma rays, so we can't see them, on the visible light spectrum. So an image like this, for example, doesn't show them. But the gamma rays that they are letting off from the center of the galaxy, like all these red ones here, they are a lot more powerful than these other gamma rays, all these blue ones here. And one potential explanation for this has been that these red powerful gamma rays are all being ejected from the center of our galaxy, and what is at the center of our galaxy? A supermassive black hole. So the idea is, like certain neutron stars, for example, the gravity around this black hole is just so immense that a bunch of the matter and energy and stuff that it's absorbing gets kind of spun around the rim of it and then shot off, on the top and on the bottom in these insanely powerful beams of energy, essentially. And these beams are what we are observing as this, gamma radiation. And obviously they wouldn't be like straight up beams, like super clean lines sort of thing, because it is so far away, the light would disperse and it would bounce off other stars and planets and gas in the universe. So you would expect to see something a little more diffused like we do see. So yeah, a super, super cool entry. I quite like the theory for this one. I think it's quite reasonable, but as with a lot of these super complex, super spacey sort of entries, we don't currently officially know the cause for them. So they are, at least for now, a mystery. I still love it though. Fernando Alonso Formula One test session crash. And boy, that's a long title. But this happened in 2015 when Fernando Alonso, who was a Formula One driver for McLaren, he was driving along doing a test run of the track, and suddenly, just after he turned around a corner, his car just inexplicably, turned to the right and smashed into a concrete wall. And this was a rather strange crash because there was nothing in that direction. It's not as if he was trying to turn a corner or go around a bend or something. Like, this part of the track was fairly straight and he just all of a sudden turned right smashed into the wall. So as soon as he crashed, the medical personnel rushed over there because he was seemingly unresponsive. He wasn't able to get out of his car. And so they did go over to the car and eventually airlift him up to a hospital. And McLaren, the company that owned the car, you know, the race team, they basically said like, yep, there's nothing to see here. They said in their report that Fernando wasn't even injured, that they couldn't find any faults on the car, like it was just a freak accident. They even said that possibly a random gust of wind came in and knocked the car onto the side, which, I mean, this was just an insane statement to make, because some of the other, you know, fellow drivers and even Fernando himself said that at the speeds that these cars are going, they're, you know, super aerodynamic, they're super low down, and they said that even like a hurricane wouldn't be able to knock the car to the side. So with McLaren saying a random gust of wind did it, it seems like they're trying to make excuses for a badly designed car, or at least a well-designed car that had some mechanical faults. But Fernando's account of what happened was he just came around the corner, he was driving in somewhat of a straight line for this, you know, part of the race, and then all of a sudden, inexplicably, he doesn't know why, the steering wheel just turned to the right, and then he crashed into the wall. But what officially caused the steering wheel to turn to the right is basically this mystery. Nobody knows what caused it. And yeah, McLaren said that Fernando was uninjured, when in reality he had to be airlifted to the hospital. He had a concussion, he was there for a few days, and there are some sources that say he even lost his memory, with him quoted as saying like, "I'm Fernando, I like to race cars. Someday I want to be a Formula One driver." So his memory had like reverted back to a child or something. But he seemingly fully recovered from all this, and yeah, nobody knows to this day what caused that car to swerve to the right and start the crash. The Forest City Killer. So this was a case that was very, very hard to find online, honestly, but it essentially focuses on this one serial killer in Ontario, Canada, and specifically in London, Ontario, not London, England, London, Ontario, Canada. I should have just said Canada. But this was a serial killer that operated in that area in the 1960s and 70s. And one of the most famous cases in this string of murders was of a 15-year-old girl called Jackie English. And she was a girl who lived with her mum. Jackie was out working one evening, and she apparently didn't have a ride home. So she was out, she was stopped by a car. And it's important to note that she seemingly, according to witnesses, got into this car willingly, which made police think that either she knew the person in the car, or the person was, you know, charismatic enough, charming enough to convince her to get into the car and have a lift home sort of thing. And when she got into the car, she went into the back of the car, and the back door was opened for her, meaning that inside the car there was likely at least two people. So, you know, one driver and one person sitting in the back of the car. And this was the last time that Jackie was ever seen alive. She got into the car was heading in the direction of her mum's home. So I guess she thought, or at least they told her, that they were, you know, driving in that direction. But the car almost immediately did a U-turn, turned around, and went back out away from her mum's place towards seemingly the outskirts of town, the country roads sort of area. And it was in this direction that Jackie's body was found 5 days later, half naked, floating in a creek. She had suffered a blow to the head, likely knocking her out or even killing her, and she had been assaulted. And for this particular case, there honestly really wasn't much evidence. There weren't many leads, and there was some evidence for this case, like DNA evidence sort of thing, as a bunch of Jackie's clothes they found just thrown about the countryside. So seemingly what happened is her clothes were removed while she was in the car, and then they were thrown out the window either by her assailant or by Jackie herself. But with the DNA evidence, either they didn't do DNA tests, or at least they didn't do many of them, or they did do them. It's not exactly clear on this, but they just turned up no results sort of thing. And this case kind of ended up being a dead end. But there was another case which was kind of adjacent to this one, and that was the case of a girl named Betty Harrison. And she was left alive for whatever reason, but it was thought that the person who attacked Betty actually knew her, and that at the start at least, she was lying in order to cover up for them, because she didn't want to get in trouble. But eventually she did point the finger at someone, and that someone was a man named Glenn Fryer, and he worked as the principal at a children's psychiatric hospital. And this dude was honestly a bit of a creep. He was a little like preachy, charismatic, but in like a creepy way. He walked around with a limp everywhere. Apparently he was just kind of a weird dude. He would get angry at people randomly. And so, with anger possibly comes aggression or violence. And with violence maybe comes murder. So he was arrested on Betty's accusation. He was put on trial for Betty's attack. And because this was such a big media sensation at the time, Glenn thought that if he went before a jury of his peers, that because it was such a well-known case and like, you know, the local people were out for his blood sort of thing, that they would just convict him and say he was guilty no matter the evidence. So instead, he went for a trial by combat. I'm only kidding. He went for a trial by judge instead. And the judge, after the trial, when the trial concluded, basically gave him the sentence of not proven, which isn't guilty and it isn't not guilty, but not proven basically means like you probably did it, but there just isn't enough evidence to prove that you did it. Essentially saying the judge likely thought that this guy actually did this crime, but that there wasn't enough evidence to, you know, legally prove it. And it was thought that at the time, through a few like linkages of evidence sort of thing, that whoever committed this attack on Betty likely committed multiple other murders and attacks around London. And one of these potentially was Jackie English. So you have this creepy guy who very likely committed the attack on Betty. He likely also committed these other murders and assaults, but the judge wasn't able to sentence him. And it was said that the judge during this sentencing, or during this, you know, giving of his verdict sort of thing, the judge was actually crying, and he told Glenn Fryer, that if you did commit these crimes, genuinely, if you did, then please seek help. You know, basically saying we can't arrest you, there's not enough evidence, but please, for the love of God, stop doing this. Which is just an insane scene to imagine. The case basically ended there. Glenn was never convicted of anything further or additional, and while a lot of people do think that Glenn was actually behind this all, it has never been confirmed, and to this day, we still don't know who attacked Jackie English or who committed all of these other murders around this area of London in Canada. Fuzzy, cold, dark matter. And we have a lot of science-y, spacey entries this week. And boy, this is a complex one. Like, really complex. I had trouble finding it and doing research on it because I found that a lot of the people explaining it didn't really explain it in like simple, easy to understand terms. I guess because they thought anyone researching this would have a lot of knowledge to begin with. So they were using all these super advanced terms and references and all this. And I was like, I have no idea what these people are talking about. But eventually I did dig around, I found the definition of this, and now I will simply, hopefully, explain it to you as well as I can. But this basically just tries to solve a problem called the core cusp problem, which is a problem related to dark matter, which we just kind of explained a little bit earlier on. So hopefully you remember that definition. Long story short, it is huge amounts of mass and matter, which we can't see, but that does interact gravitationally with other matter. So this unknown stuff all throughout galaxies, all throughout the universe, producing gravity, but that is completely invisible. But the core cusp problem is basically like an observation where if dark matter behaved kind of, you know, as you'd expect it to behave, then you would find the majority of mass and matter at the center, more or less, of galaxies. Because, you know, matter attracts matter, mass produces gravity, essentially. I mean, not really, but, you know, the more mass something has, the more gravity, and the more gravity, the more it pulls in other mass, so it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and more concentrated towards the center sort of thing. So scientists said what you'd expect to find is lots and lots and lots of dark matter and mass at the center of the galaxy, and then outwards towards the edge of the galaxy you'd find, you know, you'd find bits of mass, you'd find some dark matter there, but most of it would be in the center. But what you actually find is that, yes, while most of it is in the center, it's not like a huge majority of it. It's still pretty well spread out all around the other parts of the galaxy. And this is essentially the core cusp problem. So as you can see in this lovely illustration on this guy's video, as you get closer to the center of the galaxy, which is closer to the left, then this black line, which is the mass or dark matter sort of thing, this goes up quite linearly, but also quite sharply. So it goes whoop, that's the sound it makes. But what we actually observe is this other line, where as you get towards the center, the mass and the dark matter does go up, but just not as dramatically as we would expect. So now that we understand that problem, scientists have obviously come up with some explanations for why this is occurring, and one of them is something called fuzzy dark matter. And this is basically a type of dark matter in a way, where instead of it just being a particle or a fairly short wave of like a few miles long, this type of dark matter would have waves that are like 10,000 light years long. So again, forgive me if I'm not explaining this perfectly, but if you can imagine this being our galaxy. Now, if dark matter was like made up of little dots, so really kind of short waves or particles sort of thing, then you could, in theory, concentrate all of these particles at a particular point in the galaxy. If they were little dots, you could put them, all around this little center, and so you'd have tons of mass in the center, but not really much on the outside. But if dark matter is fuzzy, which is this theory, then you wouldn't have dots of dark matter. They would be, as I said, like 10,000 light years across, or more or less sort of thing, but very, very long. So you wouldn't be able to concentrate them all in this little center, because the dark matter themselves would, spread out over a long distance. So even if you put all of them originating in the center, you would still get these little bits on the outside that do cover some areas. So you could, in theory, have all of the dark matter converging in the center, and yet still have tons of mass on the outskirts of the galaxy. So a pretty cool theory, I think. One that, for me, instinctively at least, seems quite sound, quite logical, but it is an insanely complicated topic, and people have been, studying this their entire lives, so I don't pretend to know as much as them, but from what I've read, from what I've studied about it, it is some super fascinating stuff. But this entry is, why is this occurring? And honestly, we have our theories, but we don't really know. Gail Lenoar Cookson was this 35-year-old woman who went missing from Sacramento, California in 1984. Now, this case is a very strange case indeed. There are very few details about this case, and from the few details that I could find, Gail either went missing from her home or just after leaving her home, and foul play was suspected somewhat, and that is all I could find. We have this photo on the missing persons report, and the photo does seem like a somewhat dated photo of her, so she was likely older than this when the disappearance happened, and she's listed as a Mrs. Gail Cookson, but there's no mention of a husband either living with her or living apart from her, or deceased, or even working overseas like in the military or something. There have been searches done for anyone in her immediate family. Nothing's really turned up. No one's come forward to say that they know her, or at least knew her. And yeah, that was basically it. There were a few other Cooksons listed within the area, but all of those have either moved or disappeared, or they've since died, since this was, a few years ago, to say the least. But there was, however, this one Yvette Cookson, who quite honestly looks insanely similar to Gail. Like, I'm pretty sure those are the same glasses she was wearing as well. So this could potentially be another photo, another report of Gail under a different name sort of thing. Maybe she had 4 names, or it could be something like a sister or a twin. But this Yvette Cookson is listed as having died in 2007. So as I said, it's a very confusing case. The case seems to be a little bit all over the place, and no one to this day knows where Gail is, what happened to her, whether she's dead or alive, and 40 years on, I think, sadly, it's unlikely that we will ever find out. The Gatton Murders was a really peculiar case that took place all the way back in 1898, Australia. As well as being called the Gatton Murders, these were also called the Murphy Murders, because it was 3 members of the Murphy family, Michael Murphy, age 29, and his 2 younger sisters, 27-year-old Nora and 18-year-old Ellen, who, while coming back from a dance one night, were all quite brutally murdered. What basically happened was Michael borrowed his brother-in-law's sulky, which is this thing, and he took his 2 sisters out to this dance which was somewhat nearby, but when they got there they were told that basically the dance was cancelled, so they had to make their way home, and they just never came home. And so the next morning, the mum of the family asked her son-in-law, the same guy who had lent his sulky to Michael, she asked him to go out there and find where they went, look for them sort of thing. And he followed the route from the dance back to the home, and he saw the trail of his sulky. And so he decided to follow the trail along this country road, and he noticed at one point that it just veered off the side of the road, and so he followed this. It went off into a field, and when he tracked it all the way down this field, he found the bodies of these 3 Murphys. Both women had been assaulted, Michael had been shot in the head, and all 3 of them seemed to have suffered like a brutal beating. Their heads were smashed, even some of their brains were, showing. Like, it seemed to be an absolutely brutal attack. And so this guy who found the bodies, naturally he was in shock. He didn't really know what to do. He went to get help, and the closest source of help wasn't the police station, in town, but he went and told this nearby hotel what had happened, what he'd found, what he should do sort of thing. And they said, yeah, absolutely, go to the police. And so he did contact the police, but because he told the people in this hotel first, by the time the police actually got there, the entire field, the area was like swarming with these people from the hotel. There was a bunch of people standing around, looking, being like in shock sort of thing. And obviously this was an active crime scene, so it is thought a bunch of the evidence and the trails and the tracks leading up to the bodies that, might have had footprints from the murderer sort of thing, that they were all trampled upon, and it was basically useless for gathering information or evidence. The local police got to the scene, they realized what this was, and then they were like, we are just out of our depth sort of thing. They didn't collect any evidence on the scene, they didn't write any notes, and they thought, we need the national police for this case. A triple murder, a crazy attack, maybe it's a serial killer. They needed some more muscle for this case, and so they went back into town to send a telegram to the national police headquarters. And when they left the scene, they put a bootmaker, one William Devitt, in charge of, make sure you secure this scene, don't let anyone in sort of thing. And he was just like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And he just never actually did, because, he's a bootmaker, he's not a policeman or anything. So more people came and visited the scene, more evidence was, destroyed or lost or tampered with, and the police were obviously in town sending this telegram to the headquarters. And when they went to send the telegram, they told the telegram sender, to mark this as urgent, it's got to get there as quickly as possible. And the telegram sender said, it'll go at the normal speed. You don't have the authority to, make stuff urgent like that. And he was like, oh, okay, you must be right sort of thing. Except that police did absolutely have the authority to mark these telegrams as urgent, but this policeman apparently didn't know his rights or his powers well enough, and so the telegram was actually delayed in getting sent there. And then when this telegram did eventually arrive at the headquarters, it just happened to be a holiday, so they didn't actually open the telegram till the following morning. And then this is where things get even crazier, if you can believe that. But the inspector in this criminal investigation branch, of the police, decided not to send any police to Gatton, where the murders took place, because he said that he heard rumors that these murders were a hoax. And then the next day he was informed that these murders were in fact not a hoax, and he still didn't believe them because he said that this information came from unofficial channels. So then they sent it through official channels, and then he was kind of forced to accept that these murders actually happened, and so he sent some policemen up to Gatton. And because of the urgency of this, he sent them ASAP. Except it wasn't ASAP, because on the day he sent them, there was actually a train going to Gatton at midnight, and the policemen, I guess, weren't really too bothered about this. It's too late, leaving at midnight. I don't want to be traveling through the night sort of thing. So they just left in the morning. They got the 7:30 a.m. train, and so eventually the police from Brisbane arrived in Gatton 48 hours after the murders took place, or even after the bodies were found. And the bodies were moved to this nearby hotel. They were inspected, an autopsy was done, and it was here they found out how the bodies had died, what sorts of injuries were on them. And the investigation lasted around 5 or 6 months. No one was arrested for these crimes, even though there were a few suspects, there were a few interviews, and one of the main suspects actually was a local butcher who was, a little bit weird, a little bit loopy. He was often seen walking along these country roads, just, being a little sus. And he was actually suspected for another murder. And there was a revolver that was found abandoned nearby his workplace that had in its chambers 4 rounds spent, which is the exact amount of rounds that were used both in the Murphy murders and in this other murder that he was suspected of. And he said, that's not my gun. I've never even seen that before in my life. And yeah, as I said, they couldn't really prove it or stick it on him, so no one was arrested for this case. Another theory was that there was some incestuous relationship within the Murphys, or between the Murphys, and that either someone from outside the family found out and thought it was horrible and, attacked them, or someone from inside the family wanted to keep this a secret, and so it was an inside job by the family sort of thing. Or another theory said that the police had something to do with this, partly I think as a way to explain just the sheer incompetence of the police. They didn't secure the crime scene, they came incredibly late. Even the police in the headquarters didn't really seem to want to go out to this place or investigate this murder at all, or set of murders, as there was 3 people killed in this one. And the inspector in charge at the time, the one that thought this was all a hoax sort of thing and constantly delayed sending police down there, he was eventually removed from his position because it was kind of put forward that he didn't really care about the population, he didn't care about the public, he wasn't doing his job to help protect the people, to investigate murders sort of thing. I think it was a guy who just liked having a job, this was his job, he was going to do it the way he wanted to do it, and yeah, didn't really seem like a genuine guy. But sadly, probably because of the incompetence of these police, this case was never solved, a bunch of the evidence was missing or unusable, and we never did find out who committed this absolutely brutal, horrific attack. Hale Boggs. So this was a guy who in 1972 was actually the majority leader for the House in America, or the majority leader for the Democrats in the House. And he was also, and this might not necessarily be important, but it also might be important, he was also on the Warren Commission, which was the commission the group created to investigate the JFK assassination. So keep that in mind for a little bit later. But he was out campaigning one October in Alaska with the representative from Alaska, Nick Begich, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But Hale, Nick's assistant, and the pilot, because they were all in a plane, but all 4 of them were in a plane going from Alaska to Juneau, and while they were in this plane, flying through the air, they just went missing. Like, it was super strange. There was no plane found, no crash, no bodies, no signals, no like emergency mayhem signals sent out, just nothing. They were in the air seemingly 1 minute and just didn't exist the next. There were searches done by the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Army. There were flights overhead done all around the area by the Air Force, even by civilian aircrafts, looking to lend a hand sort of thing. And yeah, there was no crash found, no wreckage, no plane, just nothing. And about a month later, the searches were called off. It was ended sort of thing. And somewhat strangely enough, Hale and Nick both won their upcoming elections 2 months after this, even though they were both either missing or dead. So it must have felt pretty bad to be the other guy, losing to someone who's not even alive. Like, if the people thought that someone who's not even existent would make a better job at this position than you would, that's a pretty low blow. But because both of these people were, declared dead, a special election was held after this. But we still don't know what actually happened to the plane or any of its passengers. Did they crash somewhere and the wreckage was just never found? Did they crash into the ocean and then just sink down? Or were they escorted out of the air by a US military craft or by a Russian aircraft somehow for some reason? And was this done to, maybe silence Boggs? Because as I said, he worked on the Warren Commission. Maybe he knew a thing or two. They didn't want him speaking. That, in my eyes, is always a possibility. But it is a rather strange case nonetheless. The Hammersmith Nude Murders. So these were these murders that took place in London, England in 1964 and 1965. The victims were all, sadly, as they quite often are, adult workers, and they were all found having been stripped down after they were killed, or at least before they were killed, and they were all found near the River Thames. And because they were stripped down, the murderer was subsequently dubbed Jack the Stripper, which, that's creative, guys. And these murders were dubbed the Hammersmith Nude Murders. Now, throughout all of this, there was only one potential sighting of this killer, and this rough sketch was drawn up based on what the witness said that they saw. But even this sighting itself wasn't really clear. Like, the witness wasn't entirely sure, like, did the guy look like this or this? They had like a vague kind of idea, description of what they saw. So yeah, even this sketch of the killer isn't necessarily 100% accurate either. And I would get into some of the finer details about these murders, but they are honestly just all so insanely brutal. But essentially, they were all left naked, strangled, and humiliated, just all-round awful stuff. There were at least 6 murders that the police think were highly likely to be linked, as well as 2 earlier murders in 1959 and 1963, which the police think are likely linked to the others, but the connection isn't quite as solid, as the others. So we're looking at least 6 murders here, potentially up to 8 murders. And at the time, this case got a lot of media attention. The police interviewed upwards of like 7,000 suspects. And of these 7,000 suspects, there were quite a few that the police kind of narrowed it down to. And then over time, they narrowed it down even further. And one of these suspects was a 57-year-old caretaker named Kenneth Archibald. And he, in 1964, actually confessed, like willingly came out and confessed to the murder of one Irene Lockwood, which was one of the women killed during this, spree or attack. And so he went to the police, he admitted to the murder, he confessed, he went through the trial process, and basically just as he was about to be convicted of this, murder, he retracted his confession, and because they didn't really have any other evidence on him, the court essentially had to just let him go, which honestly, what a bloody waste of time and resources. He should at least get charged with like wasting police time or something like that. And why he admitted to this, if he did it, if he didn't do it, it's not really clear. There was also a security guard named Mungo Island, and he was considered a suspect due to some interesting evidence that was found on some of the victims. And that evidence was these little like specks of paint, and they were found in various spots all over these victims. It was a little subtle, but the police suspected that wherever the bodies were kept, maybe wherever the bodies were killed, had something to do with paint, a workshop, a construction site, and they were actually able to trace these flecks of paint somehow. Don't ask me how they did it, but they were able to trace them back to this place called the Heron Trading Estate, and just across this trading estate was a paint shop, and it was at this estate that Mungo Island worked as a security guard. So the police came up with this theory. They announced that they had, traced the paint back to this place. They suspected Mungo, and shortly after this, Mungo took care of himself, shall we say. He left a note to his wife saying that, "I can't stick this any longer. To save you and the police some time, you can find me in the garage." And his body was found in the garage, in his car, unresponsive. Some people think that he did this to himself as a way to avoid being caught or captured or punished, sort of thing. Some people think that he was actually innocent and he was just so stressed from these accusations, like he thought that the accusations would ruin his life and he couldn't live with it, and so then he did what he did. But nobody really knows on that one. And there was also this local boxer who was rumored to have committed these crimes, but there wasn't really a massive amount of evidence for that one. And there were, as I said, a few other suspects, a few other theories, stuff like it being an inside job by the police for some reason. But ultimately, with all the theories, with all the suspects, no one was ever officially charged for this crime, or these string of crimes. And so officially the person who killed all these women is still unidentified. The Isdal Woman was a name given to an unidentified woman who was found dead in Isdalen, Norway in 1970. And this was a very odd case. The woman, as I said, was unidentified. She didn't have any ID on her, nobody knew her, but she was traced back to where she was last seen at a local hotel. The hotel staff gave their description of what she looked like. She was quite an attractive lady, she was quite well guarded, like she didn't have guards, but she kept to herself, she was quite secretive, and she paid everything in cash. There was no cards or identification sort of thing. And then she left the hotel and was subsequently found dead up on this hiking trail. Now, there wasn't really much to go on initially for this case, but they did after a few days find these 2 suitcases that belonged to this woman, and they were left abandoned at the local train station. And when they opened the suitcases up, what they found just confused them more than before. Inside the suitcases were clothes, wigs, glasses, sunglasses. There were multiple maps, timetables, identifications, and various types of currency from like Norwegian, Belgian, Swiss, British, German, and French money, and a notepad with obviously notes inside of it. All the identifying points or brands on these clothes were like taken off. There was no receipts for anything, so it's hard to tell where she came from, where she originated from, where she was going, apart from, the timetables and her notes, because when they looked at her notes, they were able to basically figure out where she had been. And these notes were basically places all over Europe that she had either visited already or had planned to visit. And when the police cross-referenced these locations and these times, they were able to find handwritten like check-ins for certain hotels, and they found that the names used on these check-ins varied quite a bit. So this woman used as many as like 8 different identities, different passports, names, addresses, and apparently disguises with these wigs and the glasses and the different clothes. So, like, what exactly was going on here, and what even happened to her in the end? And that is kind of the big question on this case. She was found with huge levels of sleeping pills within her system. So initially it was thought that she might have, done this to herself sort of thing, but she was also seemingly very, very badly burnt. Like when she was found, she was lying there almost as if she had like died from being set alight or something, which typically you don't really go around doing that to yourself. There was burnt paper and stuff around her when they found her. There was also traces of like petrol around the body, around the scene. And she also had soot in her lungs, which means when she was set on fire or when she was thrown into the fire or stumbled in or whatever, she was still alive, she was still breathing because the, soot was able to get into her lungs. There was also some bruising found around her neck, which police thought might have been either from a fall or an injury of some kind, or perhaps an attack. And honestly, in my opinion, it doesn't really seem like she did all of this to herself, or even really any of it to herself, as I don't think she would or even could, quite honestly. And this was obviously in 1970, in like the Cold War era sort of thing. So theories about her being a spy, being a sort of undercover sort of woman, they obviously arose and were explored. And I think something like that is maybe more than likely. It makes sense with the different disguises, traveling all around Europe, different names, different identities, and her being killed in the end. Seems like someone was just trying to cut off loose ends sort of thing. And what they eventually figured out was that this lady took a taxi from outside the hotel to the train station, and that's where she obviously left her luggage, left her bags, and then for some reason she ended up the mountain on this hiking trail, and it was there that she died. So they went looking for this taxi driver, but nobody really came forward for it until someone came forward anonymously. They said, yes, I was the taxi driver that took the woman that day, and he said, I took the woman from the hotel to the train station, but we were also joined in the cab by a male. So this lady likely wasn't alone. He never did come forward saying who he was. He never wanted to be identified. So perhaps the taxi driver saw something that he shouldn't have seen, or he was intimidated or something, but it seemed like he was at least scared, if not cautious. There was also a man that was hiking up on these mountains, or on this trail, that said that he saw a woman up there who was walking. She looked kind of, quiet, like she didn't want to talk, and she was accompanied by these 2 men. And he thought that this whole scene looked a little strange, a little suspicious, enough so that when he got down from this hiking trail, he immediately went to the police station to report this, and they basically told him to just forget about the whole thing. They said, oh, a woman hiking with 2 guys? Like, that's not suspicious at all, don't worry about it, sort of thing. And then this lady was found. So, like, what the hell sort of police are you? And that's basically as far as the case went. The woman was never identified. They never found anything more to, identify her with or by. The 2 men were never identified. Where she came from was never figured out. None of her relatives came forward, sort of thing. So it was just a complete mystery. She was buried locally nearby and given a Catholic funeral. But who she was, where she came from, what she was doing in Europe, and who these two strange men were, was never figured out. Jeanne Van Calck was the heartbreaking case of this 8-year-old girl who was found dead in Brussels in 1906. Jeanne was often living with her grandparents at the time, as her mother tended to be working, and the dad had generally abandoned the family. So yeah, as I said, she was living mostly with her grandparents. And this case is honestly just heartbreaking to go over, but Jeanne normally went to her mother's house every evening for a few hours, and she was brought there normally by one of her grandparents, except for this evening, where for the first time ever, she went all alone. And this was because her grandfather was working at the time, and they thought, just this once, she has to grow up eventually sort of thing, and she was allowed to go to her mother's on her own. And after she left the house, she never turned up. Around midnight that same night, this guy and his son found this suspicious package that was left outside one of the abandoned houses in town, and they called the police. They eventually opened up this package, and they found inside the dismembered body of Jeanne. She was missing body parts. Her cause of death was marked as suffocation, specifically after being forced to drink a large amount of alcohol, and she likely suffered some violent abuse before her death. So yeah, as I said, just a terrible, difficult case to go through, some of the worst stuff imaginable. And the coroner said because of how the body was likely, dismembered and dealt with sort of thing, that whoever killed her likely had some experience, whether that was as a butcher, as a surgeon, or a doctor or something like that. But it was quite a meticulous and careful job. So obviously they immediately started looking for local butchers, doctors, butcher's assistants sort of thing. There was a massive immediate search done. They started draining canals looking for Jeanne's other body parts, looking for any weapons that were disposed of or any evidence of any kind. And eventually her legs turned up left somewhere in another package, some really creepy stuff. But despite all of this, the killer was never found. There was a ton of backlash from the public on this case, as they thought the police acted too slowly, they did a terrible job with evidence and with suspects, and obviously the victim in this case was someone super young, super vulnerable, so I think the public kind of had a right to be upset. But as I said, no one was ever charged or convicted for this case, but still, rest in peace, Jeanne. The Keddie cabin murders. So these murders were just all sorts of messed up, and we're going through quite a few of these this week apparently. But this case involved the Sharp family, namely Sue Sharp and her 5 children. And the whole family originally lived in Connecticut, but after Sue broke up with or divorced her husband James, she moved with the kids all the way from Connecticut to California, and she was living in this cabin sort of place in the resort town of Keddie. And on the day that this incident took place, a few things happened, and I don't think they're all relevant, so I'll just name the relevant ones, or the relevant things that happened on that day. But on this day, Sue drove down into town with her 5-year-old son Greg and her daughter Sheila, and she was driving into town to collect her other son Rick, 10-year-old Rick, who was there trying out for a baseball team. So she and the other kids picked Rick up, and while they were there, she saw her other son, John, and his friend Dana, and they were both trying to hitchhike back into or out to where they lived. So Sue, the mum, picked them up as well and drove them, a little ways closer. So at this point, they basically all went home. John and Dana later hitchhiked back into town because they had, plans to meet some friends out there. And that's basically what happened in the whole lead up to this case. Nothing super important, but it just kind of shows where some of the family was. The boys were seen later that day in the city, so it's known that they did at least make it out to the city. And Sheila, Sue's daughter, had plans to stay in their neighbor's house, sleep over at their neighbor's house. And so around 8 o'clock that evening, Sheila left her house, the family house, and she went next door to the neighbor's house. And at this point, Sue's other daughter, Tina, was also at this same neighbor's house, but she was over there watching TV. She didn't really have any plans to, stay the night like Sheila did. So it's a little confusing with so many people, so many family members. But basically what you have is Sue, the mother, her 2 young sons, Greg and Rick, all 3 of them are at home. You have Sheila and Tina out at the the neighbor's house, and you have John with his friends, with his friend Dana out in town, still not home. Now, they were planning to likely hitchhike or make their way back home eventually, not too late into the night. And it was around 9:30 p.m. that Tina, one of the daughters, left the neighbor's home to go back home as she wasn't staying over. And at some point, it's not entirely clear, but at some point, John and Dana were dropped off to the house. And that's all we officially know really up to that point. And then Sheila slept over next door. She, went to sleep. She woke up in the morning, maybe had a little bit of breakfast, and then went back next door to her family home. And what she saw there when she opened the door was just beyond words. Her mum, Sue, had been stripped down, assaulted, and killed. She was almost decapitated with likely a large knife of some kind. She was bound. She was gagged. One of the sons, John, was dead on the floor with his throat having been slit. His friend, Dana, who he was with most of the day, was dead on the floor having been beaten and strangled to death. And there were 2 large knives and a hammer bloodied and found at the scene. Sheila immediately ran out of the house. She ran back to her neighbor's house, and the neighbors came over to the house. They opened the back window. They, ushered the remaining young children out, which the other young children, the 2 younger sons, and one of their sons' friend, Justin, they were all seemingly alive and well, which, thank God. But they were taken out the back window, brought to safety. The police were called, and an investigation was started. But what they realized was Tina, who was the 12-year-old daughter who, left the neighbor's house last night to go back home, she wasn't dead, but she was also nowhere to be found. One of the neighbors, the one that Sheila stayed at for the night, said they didn't hear anything whatsoever, and there was just one other neighbor that thought they heard maybe some muffled screaming at around 1 a.m, but it didn't really last very long. They weren't really sure of it, so they didn't call the police or anything like that. And there were a few suspects for this case, with one of the major ones being a man called Martin Smart. And he was a local neighbor. He was the stepfather of the boy Justin. You had the 2 young sons, and then you had their friend Justin. Well, this boy was the stepson of this man Martin Smart, and Justin was obviously staying in the house on that night, so that was at least some connection. And when the police went to interview this guy, when they started their investigation, they noticed you seem to be missing a hammer, from your tools. And he was like, oh, that thing's been missing for ages. I have no idea where it's gone. And he couldn't really provide a description of what it looked like. It's just a normal generic hammer. I can't even remember what it looked like. So that was a little suspicious right off the bat. And the only potential eyewitness to this entire case was actually Martin's stepson, Justin, because during this attack, or possibly after it, but at some point, Justin remembered under hypnosis, he apparently had this memory of coming out of his room in the middle of the night, and there was these 2 men there, and he also remembered the mum, Sue, being there, and that's basically what he remembered. He was able to give somewhat of a sketch of the 2 men that he saw, and all of this was taken with, a grain of salt sort of thing, because it was a young kid. He remembered this under hypnosis, so it might not be entirely accurate, but it is definitely something to go off of. The men in the sketch were never identified, but one idea about this is that Martin and his friend, John Bubade, or Bubede, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that, but they snuck into the cabin after dark. They attacked Sue, and when John and his friend came to, either stop them or just they were witnesses to the attack, they had to go as well, sort of thing. Tina might have also been a witness to this, so they ended up taking her somewhere. And perhaps Justin woke up from this commotion, came out of the room, and I think if it was any other kid, then they might likely have been attacked as well. But because it was specifically Justin, his dad or, his stepdad didn't want to attack his own son, so he just said, you're dreaming, go back to bed, sort of thing. And Justin, the young kid who's comforted by his dad, he just went back into the room and went to sleep. And that is probably one of the most popular theories about what happened. And as to why Martin would commit these attacks, we have to actually go back a little bit to the past of Sue and her marriage with her husband. Now, one of the main reasons why Sue went from, Connecticut to California was that her husband was quite abusive. So she was quite familiar with abuse. She recognized it often quite easily. She knew the signs, she knew the symptoms, and Sue was friends with Martin's wife, and she kind of recognized that Martin could be aggressive, he was abusive sort of thing, and it was thought that she was telling Sue to, you can't stay with him, you've got to leave him, you can't stay in this abusive marriage sort of thing. And when Martin found out about this, he thought that Sue was actively trying to break up his marriage, and so he decided to stop her, save his marriage in a weird, horrific, twisted sort of way, and basically get revenge on Sue for trying to interfere with his marriage. Tina's remains were eventually found buried in the ground, like skull fragments, after someone anonymously called the police and told them exactly where these bones were located. But yeah, as I said, they were anonymous. They didn't leave their name or who they were, where they came from, how they found the remains. So it's thought that this anonymous call might have been Martin, or might have been, his friend John, or anyone connected to this. And almost immediately after these murders took place, Martin drove from Keddie, where the murders happened, to Reno. And while he was in Reno, he wrote a letter to his wife, and the letter read, "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." Which, that's suspicious, right? Like, what the hell does that even mean if it's not a confession? But the letter was apparently never admitted into evidence in the original investigation for whatever reason. And apparently Martin's wife found a girl's bloody jacket on their property, like just after these murders happened, but that was never taken into evidence either, which, like, what the hell is going on here? And there were some rumors that Martin had a relationship, not like romantic relationship, but like a good friendship with some of the police in town, which there's not too much evidence for that claim. And even if he were good friends with them, I'm not too sure they would, cover up a murder for him, but it is always a possibility, I guess. And there's the fact that Martin had a counselor that he, often talked to, and apparently he admitted to this counselor that he said he killed Sue and Tina, but that he had nothing to do with the 2 boys, which it's like, what? Like, they were all killed together. So I don't see how he's admitting to killing the 2 women, but then not to the boys, as if they were like a completely unrelated case. Like, if you were there when the girls were killed, then you were absolutely likely there when the 2 boys were killed. Unless he means that, like, he wasn't directly responsible, like he didn't actually physically kill them. And if that's the case, then it's likely his accomplice did. And his most likely accomplice is, as we mentioned earlier, his friend John Bubade, or Bubidi. Like, it's just a strange thing to admit even to a counselor, like who confesses to half a crime sort of thing. But that is what happened. No one was ever convicted or charged for these crimes. Bubade died in 1988 and Martin died in 2000. And there wasn't really ever much progress in this case, except for in 2018, when police said that they had recovered some DNA evidence from the crime scene, like from some of the tape at the crime scene. They were finally able to get some DNA from it, and they said they were able to match it to a living suspect. But that was in 2018. Nobody has since been arrested for it. I don't know if they're still trying to make this link or if it was just a dead end sort of thing. But it is also strange that they said they connected it to a living suspect, and 2 of the main suspects for the case are both dead. So we don't really know who they might be talking about. But this horrific case, quadruple murder, was, as I said, never solved, and sadly the identity and the motive behind these killings is still a mystery. The Lake Bodom murders involved the murders of, and please forgive me Finnish people because I will likely butcher these names, but they were Mila Björklund, Anja Maki, and Seppo Boisman, who were 15, and 18 years old respectively. There was also a 4th person present for this. Well, the 5th person was the killer, but the 4th person present was another 18-year-old called Niels Gustafsson. He was attacked as well as, all these other kids, but he managed to pull through and he ended up surviving the attack. And this case takes us all the way out to Lake Bodom in Finland, and this was in the year 1960. Now, these 4 teenagers were out camping around Lake Bodom. They were taking in the scenery, you know, they were exploring the wilderness sort of thing. And then in the middle of the night or the early morning, someone basically jumped their tent. They stabbed through the tent at the teenagers. They threw something heavy like a rock or a brick or some other heavy object, you know, through the tent, and because it was already stabbed, it just tore the whole tent apart. And these 3 teenagers basically died from their stab wounds. And it wasn't until around 5 or 6 hours later, and this was at around like 10:30, 11 a.m. the next morning, that a local carpenter was just, you know, walking around out for a morning walk sort of thing, and he saw this ripped tent, and when he went over there, he saw the dead teenagers. He immediately called the police. They came, they found Niels still alive, so they rushed him to hospital. He ended up recovering, and it was never really found or figured out who committed this attack, but there are some interesting theories about who it might have been. One of the girls who was attacked was partially naked. There was a bunch of items that were missing from the group. One of their wallets was missing. There were motorbike keys that were missing, you know, the motorbikes that they had driven up to the lake. However, even though the keys were missing, nobody actually ended up taking the motorbikes. Like, they were still there parked up, and the shoes of Neil Gustafsson were actually hidden nearby, and that fact might be important a little later on. But as I said, as far as suspects go, there was this one kind of local crazy guy, I guess. He was known to go around, shout at people, and sometimes tear down tents and throw rocks at people. I guess he just didn't like campers for some reason. But he was investigated, he was never arrested for this, and he actually died in 1969, so, you know, a few years after this. There was also a man named Hans Assmann who actually showed up to a hospital the following morning, and he was wearing bloody clothes. Like, he said he'd been in an injury or something, and, you know, he bled on himself, but that was a little suspicious, and it was on the following morning of the attack. And he was also wanted, or not wanted, but suspected of committing 5 other murders in like the fairly local area, but they never could find enough evidence on him to, you know, arrest and convict him. And then there was a man named Pentti Soininen who was actually in prison at the time that he actually admitted to these murders, and he was bragging to an inmate that, yeah, I committed these murders, but they never caught me, sort of thing. But at the time that the murders were committed, he would have been 14 years old. So the common belief is that he was just trying to show off to some inmates in jail, and he didn't actually commit these murders, as while it is possible, I guess, a 14-year-old overpowering, you know, 4 older teenagers, it might be possible because, you know, he jumped them in the middle of the night, but it is thought quite unlikely. Now, Hans as a suspect seemed quite suspicious, you know, bloody clothing the following morning, but he apparently had quite a good alibi for that night, so that ruled him out, I guess, but it was also later determined or suspected that that alibi might have been a little bit flimsy, you know, perhaps it was faked in some way. But just before he died, he actually did confess to one of the murders that he was suspected of, but he didn't confess to any of the other ones, including the ones of these 3 teenagers. So it's like, if you're dying anyway, why not just admit to all the ones that you did? So that just makes it a little less likely that it was him, I guess. And then that leaves us with the first suspect, you know, the crazy guy who was known for shouting at people and throwing rocks at them and stuff. But the police never obtained his DNA, and as I said, he died, you know, less than 10 years after this crime took place. So it's unlikely they'll ever prove it was him. You know, they have nothing to link any DNA evidence up to. And if they do ever prove that it was him, he will obviously never do time or be convicted of it because he's no longer alive. So a bit of a tricky case. But there was, however, another suspect in this case, and that was the surviving teenager Niels Gustafsson. And eventually, all the way in 2004, so this was 44 years after the initial attack, Niels Gustafsson was arrested and charged with the murders of his 3 teenage friends. The prosecution said their version of events, you know, what they suspected happened, was that Niels got into a fight, like a physical fight with his other friend, and the fight got quite physical. This other friend broke Nils' nose, and just in a fit of rage, Nils ended up going crazy, attacking them, and perhaps after he killed one, he realized he's never going to get away with this, he needs to kill all of them, and that is exactly what he did. Then, obviously, running away looks too suspicious, so he injured himself and made it look like he was, passed out and a victim of the attack as well. Now, if you remember, Nils' shoes were hidden, somewhere nearby, and initially the thought was that Nils was sleeping in the tent, and it's not normal to wear your shoes while you're sleeping, so perhaps their shoes were outside or near the tent or something, and the thought was that the killer came over to the tent, picked up a pair of shoes, put Nils' shoes on in order to either frame him or so that the killer didn't leave any of his own prints on the ground, and then he disposed of them by hiding them in a bush somewhere nearby. But the prosecution said that that was less likely, and that the more likely series of events was that, as I said, Nils just went a bit crazy, attacked everyone, killed them, and then because, he was wearing his shoes, it had blood on, it had all of this evidence on, which they did find, by the way, but in an attempt to hide the evidence maybe, Nils took the shoes, went away, hid them in a bush somewhere, and then came back to the scene and pretended to be, passed out, unconscious. And then, obviously, with the investigation, when the shoes were found, that all kind of went away, and then it was theorized that the actual killer had taken the shoes, worn them, sort of thing. And that's basically what the prosecution was arguing. And it's certainly a theory. There's not a ton of evidence for it, but it also doesn't sound like the craziest theory ever either. The courts, however, thought that there was not enough evidence to convict him. He was not charged, he was released, and he was actually given 45,000 euros as like a compensation, I guess. But with him not being charged for these crimes, and with most, if not all, of the other suspects being dead, it does look very unlikely that this case will ever be solved, but we can always hope. The Lake Oconee murders. Gosh, more murders on more lakes. This week is not looking lighthearted in the least. But these were the murders of Russell and Shirley Dermond in 2014, Georgia. The state, not the country. And this was honestly a fairly brutal one. You had Russell, who was aged 88, which that's a fantastic age. But he was found dead in his house at Lake Oconee, and he was missing his head. Like, literally. He had been decapitated, and his head was just nowhere to be found. They searched the whole house, they searched the area, the property, but no head, and there was no sign of his wife, 87-year-old Shirley, either. It is thought that perhaps Russell was shot in the head, and so to remove any evidence, any, identification of the shell or the bullet or anything like that, they just removed the head entirely, and that was basically it. They didn't really have any leads to go on. There was no sign of Shirley until a week later, when Shirley's body was found by these fishermen on Lake Oconee, and her body had, floated up to the surface after being attempted to be weighed down by concrete bricks, which, apparently worked for a little while, but then the body came back up. It's all very horrific stuff. There was no motives found for these attacks. Nothing in the house was taken. There was no evidence left anywhere, no leads, no witnesses. It seemed very, very strange. It was kind of weird that someone would attack this elderly couple for seemingly no reason at all, kill them, not take anything, but they did. Some, evil person or people did. And to this day, Russell's head has never been found, and his wife's killers have not been found either. The Lake Winnipesaukee Mystery Stone. So this is a case involving another lake, but not another murder, thankfully. But this was this mysterious egg-shaped stone that was found near Lake Winnipesaukee in 1872, and it looks really mighty interesting. As you can see, it is a dark, egg-ish shaped stone, and this stone has like these several carvings on it. It has a face on the front, it has some corn and some bows and arrows on the side, as well as a few carvings of like the moon and stars and stuff. And where it came from, who made it, and for what purpose, we have no idea. The top and bottom of this egg have like these holes carved into them, and they're different sizes. So the top one has like a more slim and narrower hole, and the bottom one has a wider hole. So this has led some people to think that the stone might be like mounted on something. Like perhaps it used to be, you know, mounted on a stick, and then that stick was in the ground, and this acted or served as like a marker for territorial grounds or something, or the stone was carried around on a stick and it was more like a staff used by someone, perhaps a ceremonial staff. And there are some people who think that these holes that have been carved into it or drilled into it, that they are far too like smooth and precise to be ancient tools. So there's theories about this being given to us by aliens or being crafted by like this ancient civilization that had, you know, access to power tools or something. So there's a bunch of theories regarding that, but there's also theories that say this was, you know, an ancient amulet of sorts, which amulets weren't or aren't technically, you know, just necklaces, but they're more like a good luck charm or something. Like they're an item that people typically carried around or kept in their houses to ward off spirits or to give them good luck. So anything really can be an amulet. You don't need to wear it around your neck, which I only just learned that, so I don't know why I'm acting like I've known it for years. But yeah, this is a pretty interesting, unique, cool little stone. It's about 4 inches long by about 2.5 inches wide, and with the theory of it being a thunderstone. Now the term thunderstone is pretty interesting in and of itself. So in the ancient times, a thunderstone was something that would like appear when thunder struck the ground. So you'd look out in a field, you'd see thunder hit the ground, you'd run over to the spot where it hit, you know, if you could find it. And apparently sometimes you would find these ancient stones, sometimes with markings on, which I don't know how true any of that is, but the idea was that, you know, these gods were basically giving us these powerful stones, and it traveled down the lightning and they sent it down that way, and that was basically the theory. So it was theorized that this might be something like a thunderstone, but these are all just theories. We don't know exactly where it came from, who made it, why it was made, what it was used for, but it is a pretty interesting one nonetheless. The Lisbon Ripper was a man who killed at least 3 women in Lisbon in Portugal in 1992 and 1993. And these killings weren't exactly your average standard killings. I mean, not that any killing should, you know, be standard, but these 3 women were all adult workers, which sadly is fairly quite common, and all 3 women were called Maria, which that's a little strange. And also all 3 of these women were operated on in some way, like before, during, or after the attack. It was really messed up. When they were found, they were like opened up, they had organs missing, you know, their hearts, their lungs, their livers, even the chest of one of these women was removed. And all of this was done carefully, seemingly surgically, and the person would seemingly take these women from wherever they were, they would knock them in the head, as they all had head injuries, and this would either, you know, knock them out or kill them, and then they would do this twisted surgery on them and remove a bunch of their body parts. And during all of these attacks, during all of this weird surgery, this messed up stuff, the killer didn't leave like any evidence anywhere. There were no hair samples found, there was no sweat or DNA or blood samples of the killer, no flecks of paint maybe, no fibers, no skin cells or like dog hairs, pet hairs, just nothing. And in fact, the coroner who worked on these bodies said that you could, in theory, describe these as perfect crimes, as there was just so little evidence to actually go off. All 3 women were found in Lisbon. They were all within like months of each other. And since there was very little evidence to go off, the police were kind of stuck. They had no real suspects, no real decent leads. And in 2008, which was 15 years after these murders were committed, the statute of limitations for murder actually kicked in. And so nobody, even to this day, like even if they got photographic video evidence of the murderer and the murderer fully confessed, because of the statute of limitations, they just can't be charged for these crimes, which is just absolutely insane. I mentioned this before with the Japanese statute of limitations on murder, but thankfully the Japanese have updated their laws so that there's no longer a statute of limitations on murder, which makes absolute sense to me. But in Portugal, the statute of limitations is still 15 years, so with any murder that occurs, the police basically only have 15 years to gather their evidence, make their charges, and convict someone for the murders, which they didn't do in this case, and so the killer will never be found, and even if they are found, they will never be convicted. And speaking of confessing, in 2011, a man named Joel Goedes applied to be on this reality show, and this reality show was called Secret Story, A Casa dos Segredos 2, and I think that translates into a house of secrets. And the whole idea behind this reality show was that these contestants each had a secret, whatever secret they, applied to the show with, and they would all be locked up in this house, and the aim was to keep your secret, to not tell anyone, but to find out everyone else's secret. And what was Joel's secret, you may ask? Well, he said his secret was he was the son of the Lisbon Ripper. So obviously this got the production team's attention, and then they got the attention of the police, and they soon arrested Joel's father, Jose Pedro Goedes. And as he was being arrested, Jose just started admitting everything. Like, they couldn't shut him up. He was saying, yeah, I murdered her, this is how I did it, this is what I did, sort of thing. But since the statute of limitations on these murders had, expired 3 years previous, the police couldn't officially arrest him or charge him with this. So they arrested him and were investigating him in regards to another murder in the year 2000, which was, legally still an active case. And what they found, eventually they said, was that Jose was not the Lisbon Ripper. They said he gave a bunch of details that were clearly wrong, a bunch of routes that he said he took, or different types of transport that the police were able to prove in their investigations wasn't actually true. And there was one partial palm print that the killer actually left. This was like one of the only pieces of evidence, and when they tested it against Jose's palm print, they found that it wasn't a match. So, like, what the hell? Jose and his son are just making this up, apparently. I guess it was for attention, but it's still pretty twisted and just a waste of police time. But that was the end of it. Jose was released. No other suspects were, investigated or brought forward. And it's unlikely, if not impossible, that they ever will be, because in cases like this where the statute of limitations has run out already, the cases are normally closed after this, because it doesn't make much sense investigating something that you can't even charge someone for. So sadly, this case will never be solved. These 3 Marias will never get their justice, and the Lisbon Ripper is very likely still out there, still walking around, still able to, commit these horrific crimes that he did. And unless he comes forward and confesses, he won't be charged, but at least we'll know who it is, sort of thing. Unless he does that, it is unlikely we will ever find the identity of the Lisbon Ripper. And that is all we have time for. Honestly, sorry for bringing you guys down a little bit this week. If you were having an otherwise lovely day, this week's episode did end on a few pretty horrific cases. But it is always the luck of the draw with this iceberg. Make sure you are drinking water, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, thanks for watching.